Sorry about that interruption. The joys of quarantine with one's family. At any rate, I was saying the Shakers were probably the most successful group of people in terms of utopian communities that broke off and tried to reform society by being kind of an example of what society could be if structured correctly. The Shakers were very committed to the equality of men and women. In fact, it was uh, it was this belief that men and women were spiritually equal that kind of really set the Shakers apart. Um, the Shakers were called the Shakers because their religious services were sex segregated um, events where men would go off with the men and women would go off with the women, and they would engage in very vigorous dancing and worship activities. Um, in fact, the sex segregation played out in a number of different ways, including men and women living in dormitories completely apart from each other. Um, the Shaker community grew not because of natural increase from Shakers actually having sex. They were um, going to be celibate and not engage in sexual relations between Shaker members, but they would go ahead and recruit people to their communities and then also adopt orphans from orphanages into the Shaker community. Um, as much as they renounced private property, they were extremely successful in terms of marketing crops grown and some of the crafts that they made, including furniture that is still sought after as a very valuable, well-made furniture. Um, there was also a utopian community established by John Noyce. Uh, and this community was established in upstate New York and then was relocated. This was the community of Oneida. Um, Oneida was very communitarian in the same kind of vein that the Shakers were communitarian. Although the big difference between the Shakers and the community at Oneida, um, Oneida they had a system of complex marriage, quote complex marriage. This was any man or woman could make make an intimate proposition, a sexual proposition of any other member of the community, and anybody could, and if they agreed, they would go ahead and um, record that relationship in a public book. Uh, Noyce and the people of Oneida said that it was this kind of relationship would lead to a more stable society because everybody would be everybody's equals, and it was exclusive relationships that really brought a bunch of unwanted drama to a society. Um, the Oneida community was a very kind of strict community. People in the community were encouraged to go ahead and essentially call people out that weren't living up to the religious doctrines of Noise, and call each other out very publicly, which I'm sure you can understand instigated more than a few problems in those communities. There were, other than just spiritual utopian communities, there were communities established by more kind of sectarian impulses. So those that were established on less than religious lines usually were established on some kind of communal understanding in a similar fashion. It's just that they lacked the religious component that made the Shakers and the people at Oneida kind of unique. Probably the first worldly community that is discussed in Foner's text is the Brook Farm. Brook Farm is going to be populated by New England transcendentalists. Brook Farm is going to be just outside of Boston. It is going to be full of people who think that the life of the mind and the life of kind of physical labor can exist simultaneously and kind of complement each other. So Brook Farm is going to be a bunch of intellectuals and a few farmers, and it's going to try to be this self-sustaining kind of almost like a mini university. There's going to be lectures and public discourses and classes, and those people that engage in those kinds of activities are going to be expected to work on the farm, doing manual labor as well. Turns out, though, that most of the people who are going to be public intellectuals and going to be intellectual types that want to go there and deliver these kinds of academic academic discussions and academic kinds of events don't actually want to work in farms and in manual labor settings, and that's why, well, they're academics. So the farm isn't going to be as successful as many of these other kinds of utopian communities. The Owenites are the probably most important sectarian, non-religious utopian community. The Owenites were very kind of economic in terms of their orientation. They went ahead and tried to make sure that people were paid the fair value of their labors. So there were, in the Owenite society, there were no bankers and financiers and middlemen. You were essentially going to, if you wanted somebody else's goods, you were going to trade them for labor. It was a society that championed the idea of the Owenites championed the idea of kind of labor principles that were just, and it would serve as a kind of precursor to the labor movements that we would see in American history, that we are going to see in American history. Owen was actually a factory owner in New England, and he was seriously depressed at how degraded the average workers were in in a new kind of industrial economy that had popped up. And so he moved to New Harmony, Indiana. Moved to New Harmony and championed the idea of laborers getting paid the fair worth of their labor, instead of financiers and owners getting a profit off them. So fairly interesting. Women's rights and education were high on the list of priorities for the Owenites, and ultimately, the Owenites engaged in kind of very contentious debates about just about every aspect and facet of life. So it wasn't as successful as as some of the other more kind of authoritarian reform movements that were manifested with these utopian societies, or utopian communities rather. Let's talk about religion and reform. The next slide, I'm not sure which number slide this is. Number 6, religion and reform. Some of the reform movements dovetailed nicely in with the revivalism of the Second Great Awakening, and really saw the increased interest in religion as fertile ground for kind of piquing people's interest in terms of how do we change society to better reflect the religious impulses awakened in the Second Great Awakening. The revivals kind of popularized this idea of perfectionism. Perfectionism is the kind of notion and concept that society is able to be continuously improved upon by people who are willing to do the work of kind of analyzing and figuring out what ills exist in society, and are able to kind of come up with creative ways to change people's behavior and continuously improve the society that they find themselves in. Many of the ideas that had been on the consciousness of the American mind for a while moved in radical directions during this time from 1820 to 1840. Prohibition. Temperance, which is just to moderate the amount of alcohol one person would drink, moved all the way into prohibition. So not just moderation of kind of drinking, but actually eliminating drinking completely. Criticism of war became pacifism, the complete rejection of any kinds of violent means to achieve any kind of political purposes. and abolition of slavery moved from, prior to this era, a bunch of people had been for getting rid of slavery, but they offered plans of gradual kinds of emancipation and freeing slaves. This was going to be much more of a push for immediate, complete, total abolition of slavery. Good. It's, yeah. And we're definitely critics to all these reform movements. Some of the to some Americans, being part of the reform movement and being engaged in some kind of reform efforts became kind of a badge of respectability. Whereas now, to put it in the parlance of 2020, some people seem to be competing with each other as to how, quote, woke they can be, and kind of socially aware. This is not a new impulse. This was the same impulse that was seen in the early 1800s, to show that you were a member of the middle class, to show that you were a member of an intellectual America that cared about progressive causes. You wanted to engage in some kind of reform movement. So middle class people sometimes saw this as a badge of respectability. A bunch of other people saw this as a very serious infringement on their liberties and the freedoms. There were a great number of people who said, you know, by what right does anyone have the ability to kind of limit my my exercise of liberty, my free will? Certainly, when it comes to obviously, when it comes to the abolition of slavery, there were a bunch of people that were very, very convinced it was absolutely their right to own other people. When it comes to kind of the temperance movement and prohibition of alcohol, certainly there were a number of people who said, you know, if I'm no less moral if I take a stiff drink after a hard day at work than somebody who decides they aren't going to. Certainly, no one was defending your liberty to get completely intoxicated, but if you were going to drink a little bit of alcohol, that was a time-honored tradition. And certainly there was some religious aspects to it. I mean, there are a number of religions in the United States that have as a sacrament communion, and if you prohibit all alcohol, what are you going to do for communion wine? At any rate, this is one of the reasons why Catholics sometimes hotly debated questions of temperance and larger questions of the reform impulses of society. Reformers had a vision of freedom that was both liberating and controlling at the same time. It was rather contradictory. But they would say that, somebody who is addicted to alcohol, someone who is a slave to the demon rum, can ultimately be free. And so that was their kind of explanation for how to hold these two kind of contradictory ideas in one's head at the same time. To say that, ultimately, the purest expression of freedom is to not engage in all of these kinds of behaviors that show reckless disregard for everyone else, but rather the ultimate expression of freedom is to be free from any kind of dependence on anything else, be it slave labor or alcohol or slavery to poverty, slavery to the industrial economy. To get free of those things, you would have to kind of reform society, and you would have to reform people so they wouldn't engage in those kinds of behaviors that ultimately made them slaves. One very important institution that was created at this time was the invention of the asylum. This is on slide number 7, I believe, slide number 7 or 8. This is slide 8. The institution, one of the institutions that was created was the invention of the asylum. Prior to this period in American history, if you were suffering from mental illness, chances are you were going to be taken care of in your family's home. If you were an orphan, you were probably going to be farmed out to relatives. But at this time, a bunch of reformers said, we're going to have formalized institutions in our society that are going to take care of people who are not able to take care of themselves. So Americans established jails and poorhouses and asylums for people suffering from mental health problems, and orphanages. And all of these institutions were based on the assumption that people who went into these institutions, be they orphans or mental people who were suffering from mental health issues, or poor folks, these institutions were going to be structured in such a way that they could actually reform these people, and they could give them skills, and they could reintegrate them into society in some fashion that would actually make them productive members of the society. That mindset of trying to reform people's behavior and reintegrate them into society is rather unique. Increasingly, well, not increasingly, but at various points in American history, certainly institutions have been seen as places, and these institutions, such as asylums and orphanages and jails, have been seen as places to store people and put people and set people aside who are not useful to society. This era of reform was coming at the concept of these institutions from a completely different point of view, and saying that those institutions should be based on the idea that you can go ahead and rehabilitate, reintegrate, and produce productive members of a society. So that's slide 8. Slide 9 talks about the common school. The common school movement was hugely impactful in American history. The common school movement is the movement to just essentially bring public education to the masses. Championed by a lot of people, but probably the most notable educational reformer was Horace Mann. Education was seen as so important because it was the great equalizer. It was going to bring together, if you got public education that was supported by tax revenues, it was going to bring together children from all sorts of socioeconomic spectrum, and it was going to allow them to relate to each other, to see how similar they were to each other. It was also a chance to build character in methodological ways, and kind of indoctrinate young people into the ideas of democracy and self-government, and generally being productive members of society. Also, it was, in a lot of ways, public education was akin to teaching students how to accept authority, teaching students how to kind of compartmentalize their day into different periods of time that had different periods of focus, that were kind of all coordinated by a bell system that would be possibly employed at the factory that they would go work at very soon. So by 1860, on the verge of the Civil War, every northern state had public education, widespread public education supported by tax dollars. The South tended to lag behind in this respect. Southern states saw, the people who controlled the governments of the southern states, the planter class, did not want to spend a bunch of money to educate poor whites, and certainly they didn't want to educate any blacks. In fact, widespread education was probably seen as dangerous, because ultimately the more people that could read, the more people that were educated, it would probably end up trickling in and filtering into the slave population. And the slave population was kept as illiterate and ignorant of the outside world as possible, as a means of controlling them, for sure. The common school movement really kind of opened up one of the first avenues for women to join the professional class as educators. Women far outpaced men in early education, for sure. Slide number 10 talks about the crusade against slavery. This is, as we, chapter 13 is going to be a house divided. Obviously, that title is alluding to Abraham Lincoln's famous speech that a house divided against itself cannot stand, predicting that either the Union was going to become all slave or all free. That's chapter 13. Chapter 14 deals with the Civil War, and chapter 15 deals with Reconstruction. So clearly, slavery is going to be a main topic of conversation for this era of American history. One of the first topics Foner covers is the idea of colonization. There were a number of Americans who said that slavery should be abolished, slavery should be gotten rid of, and as we got rid of the institution of slavery, we would go ahead and Americans would go ahead and deport all black people and send them to some kind of colony in Africa. That colony in Africa that eventually was established was the colony of Liberia. Liberia hearkening to the idea of liberty and establishing a colony so that black people could have liberty. Liberia in North Africa is established, and the capital of Liberia is none other than Monrovia, which is named after James Monroe. President Monroe is a figure, a contemporaneous figure in American history, as they're talking about the colonization effort. The colonization effort can be seen as following the same pattern, one of the same patterns as the idea of Indian removal in the United States. The proper way to deal with Native Americans, a number of white Americans thought proper way to deal with Native Americans was to take them out of American society and deposit them somewhere else on reservations and push them outside of the area that white Americans wanted to control. And so the colonization movement and the American Colonization Society sought to recognize that the proper thing to do with black people in America was to go ahead and deport them and push them outside of American society, so that way they could be enjoying liberty, but somewhere else besides where white Americans wanted to control. The idea of colonization was extremely popular. And in fact, no less a historical figure than Abraham Lincoln, when he was very, very early on in his presidency, even mentioned the idea of colonization. So it's very popular. A European visitor to the United States actually was discussing the idea with James Madison, and the European visitor said she couldn't imagine how a mind as brilliant as Madison's could think that colonization was an actual practicable policy. So it was certainly very popular, but it was hotly debated. In terms of the most vociferous critics of colonization, the most vocal critics of colonization were definitely black Americans. Black Americans didn't want it. Well, there were a few black Americans, a few thousand black Americans that would end up being leaving the country to go colonize in Liberia. The vast majority of black Americans didn't want anything to do with colonization. They had communities here in America. They had an affinity for America, and they felt they were Americans. So, yeah, I mean, by this point, in American history, the slave trade ends in 1808. So if we're talking about the 1830s, this is a generation, at least. We are a generation removed from the people, Africans that were brought to America. So a bunch of these people that are advocating for colonization are advocating taking a bunch of people who were born in America, who have never been to Africa, who know nothing of Africa, and taking them and deporting them to some place that they have never been, nor do they ever want to go. So most African Americans adamantly oppose the idea of colonization, for sure. They insisted that blacks were entitled to the same rights as whites because, well, people should be treated as people. Good. Militant abolition is going to rise up during this time of reform movements. Militant abolition is a brand of abolition that says slavery shouldn't just kind of wind itself down. It should be abolished entirely, immediately, without delay, without kind of prevarication. So the militant abolition movement believed that the United States was just making a mockery of itself. Not only was it a moral sin, but it was in direct contradiction to the very principles that our country was founded on, principles outlined in the Declaration of Independence. One of the important publications that kind of inaugurated and focused the world on this type of militant abolitionism was David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world. In this, it says that David Walker makes a scathing indictment of slavery and says it's absolutely terrible. People that what did he call slave owners? He called slave owners perverse, essentially telling them that they were terrible, that they were horrible people, and called for all Americans, especially Black Americans, to mobilize for abolition. As militant as these calls were, there were very few people that were advocating for violence. They were advocating for a kind of passionate rhetoric and a passionate indictment of slavery as it existed. The person who was going to be kind of the most associated with this militant abolitionism was going to be William Lloyd Garrison. And that's what slide 11 talks about. William Lloyd Garrison, this is slide 12. William Lloyd Garrison is going to come onto the scene, and in 1831 is going to establish a newspaper called The Liberator. It's published out of Boston, and it is going to be the premier anti-slavery, the premier abolitionist journal. Garrison is going to say, I'm going to speak absolutely plainly, absolutely bluntly, absolutely truthfully about how terrible and horrible slavery in fact is. He's going to advocate a number of very controversial ideas that are ultimately going to be too radical for most people in the United States, but his vocal protestations are going to be really picked up by a lot of people, and is going to stir the emotions of a lot of people to really consider the question of slavery in terms of, is this something that we can allow to exist in our country? And certainly Garrison totally rejected the idea of colonization. In terms of spreading the abolitionist message, Garrison and other militant abolitionists, with their passionate kind of indictments of slavery, really resonated, again, especially when it was seen as an extension of the Second Great Awakening and the spiritual ideas and kind of movements that were going on at this time in American history. Abolitionists also took advantage of the steam-powered printing press that could print up pamphlets called tracts that were to attract your attention, to get readers interested to start reading something, and that was going to, you open it up or you turn the page or whatever, and it really hits you with some very stark kinds of messages about slavery and its evil and what should be done to combat it. At one point, they, in addition to publishing newspapers, abolitionists had printed something like 5 million individual pieces of propaganda. Certainly, they were spreading their message far and wide via printed media, but they were also taking advantage of kind of tried and true traditions of the Second Great Awakening, especially the tent revival. The person who was probably most effective at this kind of public speaking and oration was clergyman Theodore Weld. Trained a bunch of people to go around public speaking for the cause of abolition, and was very successful in using the kind of big tent revival that had been popularized and brought back into wide use by the Second Great Awakening to kind of put forward and spread the abolitionist message. Slide 13 kind of continues on and says that he certainly said that slavery was a sin, and advocated for not gradual emancipation where people kind of slowly transitioned into freeing enslaved people, but called for immediate abolition. On page 456, Foner gives another kind of section to the idea of slavery and moral suasion. The people that were abolitionists, whether they were more moderate in their kinds of reform ideas, or they were very radical and very militant in terms of their ideas, Foner calls your attention to, and this is point 5, the fact that almost all abolitionists, no matter what kind of side of the spectrum they might be on in terms of their ideas for executing the program of abolition, most abolitionists, almost all abolitionists, were just trying to persuade people by moral means, and to ask people to change. Ask people to change. Ask people to change for moral reasons, rather than trying to change people by force of arms or coercion. Also on slide 13 is the abolitionist and the idea of freedom. One of the ways that people who were defenders of slavery would kind of mock the abolitionists were to say that northern society that was much more industrial was based on this idea of wage slavery, and that people who were just working for wages in factories were in fact worse off than slaves, because they could be fired at any time, and they could be let go from their jobs. At least the slaves were taken care of, and a master was going to recognize that they had a substantial financial investment in slaves, and so they were going to take care of their slaves. Abolitionists said this was absolutely stupid. It was a stupid argument. They said that the most basic human right was the right to self-ownership. And if you didn't own yourself, then that was the ultimate kind of repudiation of your status as a human. Therefore, wage laborers in the North were much better off than slaves, because they actually owned themselves. They could decide to change jobs if they wanted to. They could they could work more. They could, start a family and work, and have someone work at home while someone else went outside the home to look for work. They could decide to engage in market activities. They could market their crops as they saw fit. They could sell to whoever they wanted to. They could buy from whoever they wanted to. They could accumulate property. And all these things meant that wage earners were much better off than slaves. This was the main argument to repudiate defenders of slavery when they said that slaves were better off than wage laborers in the North. Abolitionists advocated, and this is in slide 14, abolitionists advocated a new vision of America. the anti-slavery movement really really sought to reinvigorate the idea that had been around since the American founding, but had really kind of been pushed to the side and marginalized. That freedom really was a truly universal entitlement. Everybody was entitled to freedom. It wasn't something that was only reserved for a few special social classes. Abolitionists insisted that the blacks were fellow countrymen. They were not foreigners. You can't deport someone who is kind of intrinsically tied to a country, who is at home in a country. This is why most abolitionists were against colonization. Abolitionists, to some extent, some more radical abolitionists definitely argued that there was no permanent inferiority in regards to Black Americans. In fact, a number of Black Americans who were abolitionists said it was every free Black's duty to become as educated as possible, simply to go ahead and prove that there was no innate inferiority in Black Americans. Certainly, abolitionists disagreed about what the Constitution actually did in terms of protecting and promoting slavery, and that was pretty hotly debated. Some people said that slavery was protected by the Constitution. Other people said that the Constitution was not. Was more neutral on the question of slavery. Abolitionists consciously identified their movement with the revolutionary heritage, saying that to actually live out our founding principles demanded that we go ahead and abolish slavery. Good. Certainly in terms of abolition, this is slide 19. This is slide 15. In terms of abolition, there was there were some racial tensions within the abolitionist movement, for sure. Certainly, free Blacks in America played an important role in abolition since the very founding of this country, and this would continue in the early part of the 1800s. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and this book becomes wildly popular, and this book is produced into theatrical productions. It is a story of slavery that really puts an ultimately human characters in the roles of slaves, and shows just how insidious slavery is to to those people that are in the slave system. Probably, well, I don't want to say most importantly, but very importantly, it portrayed slaves as Christians, and it was very difficult for people. It was very difficult for many Northerners to realize that those held in bondage were Christians that believed in the same God they did, and believed that they were spiritual equals of those who were not held in bondage. Although the abolition movement was racially integrated, certainly the whites that were white Americans that were part of the abolition movement were still subject to the same kind of racial prejudices as white Americans who weren't part of the abolition movement. So unfortunately, most whites in the abolition movement saw black Americans in the abolition movement as less than. And when certain abolition societies or movements or organizations promoted people of color to positions of authority, that rankled a number of white abolitionists, and that was a cause for some discord in the abolition movement. Abolitionists launched legal and political battles against racial discrimination in the North. Certainly seeing that the more racism and the more kind of race classification that existed in the North, it would weaken the ability to kind of rouse the public's indignation at slavery. Black abolitionists developed an understanding of freedom that went well beyond the usage of most of their white contemporaries. Black abolitionists attacked very effectively the idea of racism at the most kind of intellectual, foundational levels. Folks, we're at just about an hour here. I'm not going to continue my commentary much past that. We're on slide 16, and that's about as far as we're going to make it. Go ahead and take a look at slides 16 through 23. Those are the slides that really encompass the rest of the learning in chapter 12. And be sure you go online and take a look at those crash course videos. The second crash course video on women in the early 1800s is going to cover in depth in about 13 minutes most of the ideas in slides 18 through 23. So I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully I'll see most of you guys at 4 o'clock for our Zoom meeting. All right. Stay safe.